Hello everybody and welcome back to Witchfix. Today we're looking at a non-fiction book for what feels like the first time in a while. Haven't had the energy to read one for a bit, but I picked this one because it had been on my to-read list for a while because I saw it in a consignment book emporium. I don't know if any of those words are correct. A large book warehouse. It was basically like the TK Maxx of books. We went to, when me and some friends went to Austin in Texas. It was such a massive bookstore. I only went with like carry-on bags, so I couldn't buy any of them and bring them home with me. But I did take a picture of this one, so I remember to buy it when I got back. And it is called Wiccan Warrior, Walking a Spiritual Path in a Sometimes Hostile World by Kerr, which I think is how you pronounce the name. I'm not sure. Apologies if I got that wrong. Author of the Law Enforcement Guide to Wicca and several other books, which I'll talk about in a moment. So what appealed to me about this book is that I think Wiccans on a whole get kind of a rep of being quite love and light, quite fluffy, quite opposed to conflict in all its many forms, shall we say. And yet this seemed to be from a perspective of kind of embracing the more defensive aspects of magic, of practicing paganism. Especially from a Wiccan perspective. And I was quite interested in that, specifically because I had kind of an altercation on Twitter with someone who just decided to go off about how Wiccans are all spineless, etc, etc. And although I don't consider myself to be a Wiccan anymore, I also don't consider myself to be not a Wiccan, if that makes sense. There are still some aspects of that left over and incorporated into my practice. And so I thought this book would be quite an interesting read in view of that. It is not a particularly long book, which is also why I chose it, because I felt like I needed a little bit of a rest from long reads. The actual book part of the book is only 130 pages, and then after that you have an appendix, which is an initiation ritual, and then a really extensive bibliography that goes on for, you know, at least 20 pages. It's quite comprehensive. A lot of different books and various studies and things have been referred to within the 130 pages of the actual book. I'll come back to that in a while because it is one of my main gripes. But on the whole, I did quite enjoy the book. It wasn't so much what I thought it was going to be going in, but it was quite enjoyable. Now, the author has written several other books, including Full Contact Magic, which I also kind of want to give a read, The Law Enforcement Guide to Wicca, Magical Self-Defense, Pagan Religions, A Handbook for Diversity Training, Modern Knighthood, Witch Hunts Out of the Broom Closet, and various fiction books under different pseudonyms as well. So quite a prolific writer, although I guess by Wiccan writer standards, you know, usually they have about 120 books to their name, but prolific for a normal writer. And I'm going to jump straight into what I quite liked about the book. What I liked about it is that it was clear and quite concise in how it put things. Everything was straightforward. There was very little of that trying to explain an ineffable experience, because certain spiritual experiences you just can't explain with words, but that does not stop people from trying. They will go on and on and on, paragraph after paragraph, wishy-washy imaginings, visualizations, feelings, etc, etc, and wading through all of that is a nightmare for me. I can never keep my head straight on what I'm meant to be thinking about, if I'm meant to be thinking about anything. But this book didn't do that. It was practical and down to earth, and I quite liked it. And from the very start, it sets out its terms and definitions, which I found really helpful. So at the start, like the first page, asks the question, what is a warrior? Which I think is quite important if we're going into a book called The Wiccan Warrior, to learn what that actually is. And it gives it to you on the first page. A warrior is a person who, through objective and thorough self-examination, develops an understanding of personal talents and limitations. As a warrior, you then achieve your goals using a combination of this self-awareness and willpower to overcome weaknesses, fears, and limitations. The Wiccan Warrior's path is the Wiccan Rede in action, and it harm none, do what thou wilt. It is taking responsibility for your actions. It has nothing to do with being a police officer or serving in the military. It has nothing to do with being male or female. You may be a cook, a teacher, a painter, or whatever other occupation you care to name. Every warrior is different. So that's quite an interesting way to go into it. The actual author, there's an about the author sections, but basically breaks down the fact that he was involved in the Air Force, the police, SWAT. He's been out as a pagan while working in the police force, so obviously has faced a lot of discrimination, which he does talk about in the book a little bit. I could have done with maybe more of his own personal experiences, to be honest, because as I said, the book is quite short. But page 1 of the introduction reads as follows. I've been a witch for 30 years. Wicca is my way of life. I've been a witch for longer than I have been a police officer, and I have been a cop for 2 decades. I am public about my beliefs. This makes me a bit of a curiosity, because not many police officers these days would admit to practicing Wicca. Centuries of religious persecution and intolerance by the church have made it difficult for many Wiccans to find acceptance within Western society, especially Wiccan cops. This is not merely paranoia. In the years that I've been involved in anti-defamation work, I've investigated reports of people losing jobs, homes, children, and even their lives as the result of modern-day witch hunts. We aren't the only people affected by such discrimination. Plenty of other minority groups have similar tales to tell. The spirit of the Inquisition lives on, though not as openly as it once was. So that's quite an interesting way to go down to earth. I feel like a lot of books that I read, they don't really focus on this aspect. And there was this quite interesting sort of fight going on in a pagan group that I joined recently, where someone had found a video of a pagan. I have no idea who she was or what kind of paganism she was involved in, but basically saying that people should be careful about, especially as teens, practicing witchcraft if they know that their families aren't going to be cool with it, and they should think about that before getting involved, because people can be discriminated against. People can take it really badly. And the person who'd found it was absolutely foaming at the mouth, furious that this woman had dared to say such a thing, because she was a teenager and she found this path and she was really into it and blah, blah, blah. And she just would not accept that this was a danger. She just kept saying, oh, well, it's illegal to throw your children out. It's like, oh, well, it's illegal to throw your children out, so I guess no child has ever been thrown out of their home for anything. It seems like in sort of modern times, in sort of 2020-ville that we find ourselves in, people have sort of forgotten the religious discrimination, because it's become a lot more mainstream. A lot more people are more aware now of people practicing witchcraft. But that wasn't always the case. So that was sort of an interesting point to be reading this book and also encountering that. So then we get into some chapters defining what a warrior is. And I found this quite interesting on page 6. In modern Western culture, we are surrounded by what we are told are warrior images. G.I. Joe stuff. Heroic Hollywood figures played by actors like Eastwood, Stallone, Willis, and Schwarzenegger. Gladiators solving all the world's problems with fists and firearms. I'm not such an idealist that I believe that I could do my job as a police officer without occasionally using force to manage the violence of criminals. There is a big difference between using only as much force as is necessary and the excessive force and destruction that are characteristic of these Hollywood crime dramas. I found that quite interesting as well. It's making this distinction between being a warrior as being just kind of a person who uses violence in all situations, and being a warrior who knows exactly when and how to use an appropriate amount of force to accomplish their goals. And I feel like that fit very well into my understanding of the Wiccan philosophy of it, Hanlan, do what you will. It's about kind of choosing your battles, choosing how much force that you can reasonably apply before it becomes excessive, before it becomes a matter of just harming people for no reason. So I quite liked that. I quite appreciated it as well. He also has an interesting take on like guns and firearms and things like that. Refreshing for an American person. He also on page 15 talks about being in the broom closet and says, I'm not saying here that Wiccan warriors must be public about their beliefs. I'm not suggesting that Wiccan warriors should all become involved in anti-defamation work or public demonstrations. What I am saying is that the Wiccan warrior examines the circumstances of his or her life and makes informed, realistic decisions based on the facts available. Wiccan warriors must thoroughly evaluate the neighbourhood in which they reside to determine if the risks of being public outweigh the possible gains. If you're a solitary Wiccan in a predominantly Bible Belt town, being public might not be such a wise idea. Sun Tzu once said, good warriors take their stand on ground where they cannot lose. So again, it's sort of refreshing, it's practical in a way that not a lot of pagan books that I find really are. They tend to get lost in this kind of idea of we should all be able to be ourselves, we deserve religious freedom. But there's no real practical advice on how to handle that and how to go about existing in the same world with people who would rather you didn't. So I quite liked that. One thing I will say is he does refer to Sun Tzu in that particular quote that I've read out. There are frequent, multiple references to lots of different kind of martial arts, law, a lot of different sources on that, stories about different warriors in this sort of martial arts culture. I didn't really connect with a lot of that because it's not really something that I'm personally interested in. So go into the book if you decide to read it, forewarned that there is a lot of that, a lot of quotations from books like that. And at times it was quite wearing because I was enjoying what the author was saying in their own words so much. I didn't necessarily want to read a bunch of quotes from The Art of War or Carl Jung or various other sources, all of which are in that very lengthy bibliography. So go into that forewarned. On pages 20 to 21, he raises an interesting point about how raising enormous amounts of energy is not necessarily the be-all and end-all on ritual. It kind of refers back to the quote that I read a moment ago about force and excessive force being used and when and where to use it. He basically says that a small amount of energy applied in the correct way is much better than a large amount of energy applied incorrectly. And he gives this example, just a little story about someone who started the engine of his vehicle by applying his will to the spark plugs. So applying your energy to the part of the situation that actually needs to change, as opposed to the situation as a whole, and being a little bit more incisive. And I thought that was really interesting, definitely something that I hadn't really considered before. He also mentions another martial arts reference here, Bruce Lee. He says on page 21, Bruce Lee was very good at demonstrating these flashy moves for the camera, but one of his most impressive martial arts demonstrations off-screen was his 1-inch punch. He could hold his fist against his assistant's chest, withdraw it just 1 inch, and punch with sufficient force to drop his assistant flat. Strength was only a tiny part of the equation. Energy or chi supplies the rest. So it's about using energy correctly, which I really like as a concept. He also talks about sort of knowing yourself and dealing with things like guilt and bad habits and things like that. He says on page 22 of Wiccan Warriors, they try to learn from their mistakes and celebrate the successes in their lives. Guilt is eliminated and replaced with the Wiccan read. My actions are my responsibility. If I screw up, I fix it. To the Wiccan Warrior, that counts as a victory, something she can celebrate. Which I, again, really like as a concept. There's a lot of emphasis put on this Wiccan tendency towards like hand-wringing over, like, oh, doing a spell which could potentially kill a butterfly in China. But I think it's quite a powerful thing to say, if I go out and fuck up, it's not the devil's fault for tempting me, and I don't go to God to be forgiven. I have to forgive myself, and that means that I have to decide how to make amends in a way that I can live with. So I think that aspect of personal responsibility is a really good thing to focus on in the book as well. One thing that I found really interesting was the chapter called The Creative Warrior, because it goes into depth about the creation of Wicca and talks about how it was created, which is great because a lot of books tend to sort of perpetuate this myth that, or they just pay it lip service in a couple of lines. So, oh, Gerard Gardner revived ancient pagan customs and created Wicca in 1950, whatever. But this actually talks about the component parts that went into this sort of soup that Gardner then called Wicca, and the sources of them, and whether they're really useful to us now or what their use was then, which I think was quite interesting. And so on page 31 he says, I've noticed that some Wiccans get very uncomfortable with this argument because they really would like to believe that Wicca can be traced back to some golden age. They get very upset when certain people argue that Gerard Gardner, considered by many to be the father of modern Wicca, invented a religion. The problem with this argument is that every religion in history had a starting point. It was invented by someone, somewhere. Phoenix McFarland views it this way. Religions are invented from shards of older practices. In an archaeological dig, we find one building is built upon the ruins of an older one. Our mythologies, like the phoenix, rise from the ashes of dying faiths. It is part of the circle of life. You don't need to go very far to find an example. It is a well-known and provable fact that the Christian Church incorporated many old pagan customs into their worship in its earlier years. Isn't this inventing religion? So I find that, again, quite refreshing. A lot of this book was just sort of novel to me in the sense that it deviated from the norm in books about Wicca that I had read. And he talks about the different things that went into Wicca and whether they're useful and who for, and if we discard them, what to replace them with, which is great because I've never really liked books and things that suggest that you can't really change things, or that you're sort of stuck following these rituals handed down because it's always been so. Because it hasn't always been so, and I'd like a different alternative, please. I liked his view that he says at the bottom of page 31, my religion isn't better than any other religion. It works for me, therefore it is better for me. I feel a lot of people, specifically when you're like, and this applies to all things, not just religion, specifically on social media and things, people will say like things as if they're fact, when what they really mean is, this is better for me, or this works for me. But they'll say it like, oh, rule of three, more like rule of we, or something less childish. And it'll be like, okay, yes, but that's for you. And that's quite a combative, inflammatory way to say that. Whereas if you just said, I don't follow it, but you do, and both of those approaches are fine because they're personal. And I realise it's on both sides, but I feel like people just need to talk about what is good for them and less about what is good, period. On pages 32, 33 and 34, he actually breaks down where different elements of Wicca came from. So, for example, he says that there were elements borrowed from the works of Margaret Murray, which were the terms Old Religion, Sabbat and Esbat, the organisation of covens into groups of 13, the concept that witchcraft was a religion primarily focused with fertility, and then we have things that were borrowed from Leyland, which is Charles Geoffrey Leyland, who wrote A Radio Gospel of the Witches in 1899, and quite a few things were borrowed from that by Gardner. The idea that witchcraft survived in secret unchanged, the original charge of the goddess, the concept of ritual nudity, which also owed to Gardner being a nudist himself, and then borrowed from the Greater Key of Solomon was the symbolic scourging, the use of pentagrams and triangles as symbols, appeals of the guardians of the four cardinal directions, consecrating and making ritual tools, things like that. And a lot of those things also have Christian influences in like Christian-based occultism to do with like angels and demons and things like that. I found this a really helpful breakdown of that information. Could not fact check it because I couldn't be asked, but it did seem to make sense to me, so I didn't feel like there was anything in there that was necessarily wrong. It was quite eye-opening to me, especially when he mentions, not in this section but later on, the purposes of having the sword and the athame and the wand. These are tools that I've never really felt comfortable with using. And then he talks about sort of the purposes originally behind them, describing Gardner's Book of Shadows, and I'm like, oh, okay, that's because they're not really relevant to me, because I'm not trying to conjure and control forces like demons or angels or spirits within the circle, and that's why. So a lot of interesting concepts in there as well. So if you're interested in sort of some of the historic background of Wicca, this would be a good jumping off point, and it also gives you a lot of references as well to go and read afterwards. Essentially, the end point of the Creative Warrior chapter is that we should be constantly inventing and reinventing our religion, and that saying invented isn't a dirty word. It's something that we do all the time as creative human beings. We have this impulse to create and do and hone new ideas and new things, and that we shouldn't just stay to one way of doing things because we are afraid of being less legitimate. So I found that quite interesting. Chapter 5 is the Rational Warrior, Avoiding Fundamentalism, which I also thought was quite interesting because it talks a lot about basically how Wicca and other forms of paganism, in order to become recognised and legitimised in Western societies where a lot of the practitioners are based, they have to ape the constructs and language of the existing faiths, primarily Christianity. Talking about how pagan churches have formed and clergy and the notion of that, which is more to do with trying to appease Christianity and trying to appear the same as it and just as legitimate, instead of actually serving Wiccans and pagans in the best way possible. And it talks about the end result of forming that kind of church, that kind of religious framework, is that it becomes full of fundamentalism and it becomes like Christianity. He says this on page 44. Churchianity became political. The Burning Times is an example of what can happen when such a state religion gains control over the minds of people. Christians don't have a monopoly in this regard. Look at what the ancient Romans did to the Christian martyrs in the Colosseum. Clearly this sort of activity is contrary to the Wiccan Rede, as people are being harmed. And yet, I've seen some Wiccan organisations mimicking all the above behaviours. For example, if a coven decides to purchase land or a permanent temple, it is committing itself to numerous overhead costs and responsibilities. Similarly, if a person turns their position as a Wiccan elder into a profession, i.e. their sole source of income, it puts an awful lot of pressure on them to make money by whatever means to provide the basic necessities of life for themselves. This pressure sometimes leads to questionable activities. Many modern pagan organisations that have adopted congregational models are quite benign and useful, but not all. The tendency of some modern Wiccan organisations to separate people into lay and clergy, secular and religious, is another example of dualism being superimposed on a monistic system. It's a curious thing that so many of us left traditional Judeo-Christian religious systems behind because of these activities, only to find some of our peers starting to model their Wiccan beliefs after it. Again, that's something that I find really interesting, definitely food for thought. And what I liked about this book was that so often what it was saying, especially in these early chapters, were things that I had not read in other books. It felt like a very original idea. It felt like someone had sat down and put a lot of thought into what they wanted to say about the systems of faith and to talk about Wicca as a religion as opposed to like a spiritual practice, which is very kind of airy-fairy and doesn't really demand anything of you, which I think is kind of what I missed about reading about Wicca, is reading about how it is a religion that shapes your life and your experiences and not just a spiritual thing that is very kind of freewheeling. It kind of falls between the very rigid religious strictures of like Christianity and the very free-flowing New Age kind of talk. It's sort of in the middle there because it does change, it does evolve, but also it does have these philosophical aspects that are quite interesting to look at and discuss. So this was probably the part of the book that I enjoyed the most because it was talking about something that I was really quite interested in. Where it started to differ a little bit, and I'm not going to say fall apart because it didn't really fall apart, but from chapter 6 onwards, so part 2 of the book, it focused more on practical work, on raising energy, directing energy, spell work. And I felt like I had read this sort of thing in other books before, and it kind of lost that more original edge, which was what I was enjoying so much about the beginning of the book. That's not to say that it didn't give me interesting things to think about, but at the same time, I became a little bit unstuck and wasn't enjoying myself as much. There are some interesting ideas, especially like on page 57. There is some discussion of Skyclad and where that idea came from and why it doesn't really make sense, which I quite liked. It says basically that people say that they work Skyclad to stop energy like being trapped by their clothing, and yet they'll happily raise energy in that state and then send it thousands of miles. So apparently it can get through the wall of a house and cross all this distance, but it can't get through one layer of polycotton blend. So if you, I mean, obviously if you can work Skylad if you want to, but I just don't feel, again, like that's a reasonable excuse, and the author doesn't either. So that was quite funny for me to read. He also talks about on page 60 using different mantras and things, and using them to direct and raise energy in certain ways, which again was quite interesting. Then raising energy with drumming, dance, a little bit about grounding. None of that was particularly groundbreaking. I had read it elsewhere. Obviously, if you hadn't read it elsewhere, then those would probably be quite interesting for you. Another interesting philosophical point that I came across was on page 77. He says, in many of the earliest mythologies, the deity that creates the earth and everything on it is female. The goddess/creatrix literally gives birth to the earth and its creatures. Patriarchal systems rewrote this, making the male deity the creator. Because in nature the male does not give birth, they had to come up with some different ways for their god to create. You see some interesting examples of this in later Greek myths, such as Zeus giving birth to his children out of his head or thigh. In Judaism and Christianity, Jehovah begat the universe by uttering specific words. For example, in Genesis. That was quite an interesting concept to me, although it is quite binary in its view of gender, but I will agree that men generally don't give birth. the kind of concept, and it made me really think about like the creation myths of different deities, like male deities, like, you know, they breathe life into things, they speak life, and he uses this to create a parallel between these male and female types of god creation story and these ways of doing magic, which aren't specifically male and female but seem to be related to these myths. So for example, you've got like ceremonial magic, where it's like the true names of things and magical words that are kept secret and passed down between people, and it's very much like the word and the action are what is powerful. And then there's the other style of birthing magic into the world, which is a more kind of instinctual way of performing magic, which he goes into in more detail on page 81. Now let's get back to the beginning and the other Genesis myth, the goddess giving birth. Words and ceremony are irrelevant in this nativity. It is essentially a very simple and natural internal process. Using this model, magic becomes a simple matter of raising energy and directing it with your will, giving birth to magic. So that's more about sort of raising energy and sort of feeling that energy and then directing it as yourself, and not relying on like magic words, magic rituals, magic phrases and tools and things. I found that really interesting. It was very much in line with how I practice myself, but it was interesting to see it related back to this sort of creation myth idea and written about in that sense. So again, that was quite interesting to me. He also talks about how a lot of grimoires and things of essentially old magic are fake, and gives the Necronomicon as an example, which was an imaginary book made up by H.P. Lovecraft, and then someone actually created it because there was a demand, like people wanted to read the Necronomicon from all these H.P. Lovecraft stories. And similar things have happened with other made-up books of different power. He goes into a little bit about power with versus power over, and talks about kind of having power with the aid of deities versus summoning things into the circle and then compelling them to help you. This also factors into coven dynamics when he talks about those, about how people should not try and keep lots of knowledge secret into themselves, because by sharing it they lose power, because that is just power over someone, as opposed to having power with others. Actually sharing your knowledge with other people is quite an interesting thing, which he goes into later on. He essentially talks about coven dynamics and initiation specifically as part of that closed off system of like institutional religion, like referring it back to Christianity and these titles and degrees that need to be earned. And he has some really interesting thoughts on that, so that was quite an interesting section to read. And he also talks about removing things from the Gardnerian initiation ritual because he didn't feel they were necessary, and he kind of picks this apart bit by bit, but I'll just read you a little bit to sort of go into the sort of things that he was talking about. This is from page 118. Another thing that we threw out is the symbolic scourging that many Wiccan traditions do at this point of the initiation, using a soft silken cord or some such. Before they do this, they ask the initiate if they are willing to suffer to learn, or if they are willing to undergo an ordeal before taking an oath. While this may have fulfilled the needs or fantasies of Gardner and some early British Gardnerians, I do not see that it serves any useful purpose for most other Wiccans. Gently slapping a person with a soft cord isn't an ordeal. All the evidence points to this being a means of sexually arousing Gardner. Sexual arousal wasn't the purpose of this initiation, and in any case, I don't need this to get aroused. Worse, this part of the ritual is clearly symbolic of the domination of the initiator, or priest/priestess, over the initiate. The initiate trussed up and bound to the altar, and the initiator scourging the initiate, power over stuff again. So that's quite inflammatory in the way it talks about Gardner. But it is kind of true, looking at some of the original Gardnerian stuff, about how like the goddess is always represented by like the high priestess, who is always a young and attractive woman, and quite a lot of it comes down to nakedness and sex. It does definitely feel like someone somehow is getting off to this, and if that's not your purpose, if that's not what you're into, then why would you need to keep doing it just because it's traditional? So again, really like that sort of aspect, really like the forthrightness of the author for discussing that. I also liked how they changed some of the things that the initiate has to swear to. It says on page 119, They then make you take an oath never to reveal anything about the craft to an outsider. They threaten that the measure that was taken could be used to perform magic against the initiate if he ever failed to keep his oath. In my opinion, this is just another of the things that Gardner slipped in to make the Book of Shadows look as if it dated from the Inquisition. 2, even if it did date back from back then, why take someone's measure if you're just going to give it back to them? 3, it is utterly ludicrous to make someone swear never to reveal things that can be read by literally anyone with the money to buy one of dozens of available books in print about Wicca. So I kind of like this. It's taking apart these institutions. There was sort of a sense of someone finally saying, the Emperor has no clothes, because I'd never heard someone speak like this about Gardner and Wicca before, or just those kind of hallmarks passed down into like all Wicca. So that was really quite interesting, and generally a kind of an interesting look at some of the things that people tend to just take as read or write of as read in other books about Wicca. So that's why I really enjoyed it. I really kind of want to go on and read the self-defense magic book, because I feel like that's more of what I thought I was in for with this. This tended to just be a sort of a philosophical look at using the warrior archetype alongside Wicca, whereas I was looking for more uses and methods for defensive magic. But in the end, it was quite an interesting book. Even if you're not Wiccan, I think you should definitely give it a read, because you might, one, enjoy the irreverent slant towards all things Wiccan, but also because it might help to break down some of the barriers between like Wicca and people who are just practicing like witchcraft as a craft and not as a religion. I think there's a lot that we can learn from each other, and this book was definitely useful for me as like a former Wiccan, current witch, to help me look at some aspects of my practice and reevaluate them and sort of work out what I wanted to do and what I didn't want to do. And also because some of the things that it talks about, like the use of the magical tools, the words that we use for certain things being invented by Gardner, that has trickled into just modern witchcraft as well, as a sort of like trickle through from Wicca. So it might be interesting to, even if you're not Wiccan, read about where those things come from and sort of how to assess if they're relevant for you. But definitely I recommend giving this book a read. It's not that long, so you could probably read this in a couple of afternoons as I did. And let me know via Twitter or just the comments on the YouTube version of the podcast if you had a good time with it. If you've read it or any of the author's other books, let me know your thoughts, because I'm trying to pick what to read next. And in the meantime, I'll see you in the next one. Bye!